Dear Trevor George Smith Jr., I'm going to need you to do research. I'm going to need you to go online, and I'm going to need you to purchase volumes and volumes and volumes of Black American history, because on Amazon.com, those books are plentiful for people to buy. And knowing your net worth, we all know you can certainly afford it, because what you are doing, you're not just causing tension between various ethnic groups within America. What you're doing is you're lying and disrespecting foundational Black Americans and our culture and history and legacy. You're disrespecting our ancestors. But most of all, you're making yourself look like an idiot. And it's really sad that you're going out like this, because many of your fans are foundational Black Americans. They're not Hispanics, and really, they're not Caribbeans. You know how I know? Because I grew up in the era when you were famous in terms of the height of it. And most of your fan base, I could tell you, 85% are or were, given what you've been saying lately, foundational Black Americans are the ones that help to make you relevant and make you a multimillionaire. So I'm going to dissect what this man said, but I'm going to keep it concise and to the point, because I'm going to tell you what the real deal is. And I'm going to say, as much as I hate what Busta Rhymes, because that's his name, is saying, Busta Rhymes is not the first to say it. And he won't be the last unless we stop this nonsense. Let's get into it, shall we? Hey everyone, it's a new month, and I want to give a shout out to all my subs and new subbies and listeners who listen to my latest commentary. I appreciate the love and support. Thank you very much. And shout out to Philly Phil, who has shared my video on her page. And I want to talk about Busta Rhymes giving this speech, well, not a speech, but this interview where he said the U.S. doesn't have a culture. And he gave it at this event called Soul Frito, which I'm familiar with it. It's an event that's usually in the Bronx, and it's held annually. And there's a restaurant called Soul Frito as well, unless they changed it. But I remember this like around the mid-2010s. So he's giving an interview, and he's basically saying that, you know, a lot of the U.S. culture basically comes from the Caribbean. And he was basically saying in terms of hip hop, but really not really speaking in terms of hip hop. He was talking about as a whole, that what Latin America, the island, Jamaica has in common with Puerto Rico and, you know, the other Hispanic countries in the islands is because they are Caribbean as an island. So it's like a similar heritage. Also with the music, there's a similar beat. I'm going to debunk that. Also, he says that we brought a lot of our influence to the U.S. and made a lot of the flavors that the U.S. is basically boasting about. We contributed that. We brought that there. And we basically are the backbone of the culture of the U.S. Because without us, the U.S. wouldn't be popping, because the United States doesn't have a culture. That's what he said. So when you see a lot of the urban areas, because this is key words, urban areas, he was speaking about like Jamaicans, but not all of the Caribbeans, just Jamaicans and Latin Americans, Latinos, like Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. He didn't mention Mexicans, and he didn't mention Cubans. Okay? And I'm going to get to that too, because he was wrong about that. He was basically saying that there's an influence all over different urban areas that has spread with the culture of Jamaicans and Latinos, putting their influence, putting their, not spin, but putting their what's the word? Because he uses different kind of cadence. Putting their culture to influence urban cities. Now, here are the key words to this, because I'm going to post this video. I'm going to share it. What he was talking about when he said the U.S. has no culture, that was code word for Black Americans. Black Americans who are descendants of United States chattel slavery, and also speaking about foundational Black Americans. He said that to cover himself, because he knew if he said blacks didn't have any culture, he knew that he would be a target. And when I mean a target, I'm speaking of not a good one. Like, his life might be in danger. Because Busta tours throughout the United States. Most of the states that he tours in, like I said, his fans, they're foundational Black Americans. So you going to a place like Houston, Texas, talking this, because I've seen footage of Busta Rhymes concerts. Everybody is practically Black. You do got some white people, but they ain't Hispanics. And I could spot them. I know how to spot Hispanics, because I have that as my lineage also. So I know the looks and the features and everything, because my parents taught me. And they wasn't in the audience. It was mostly Blacks and some whites, okay? Even a couple of Asians, all right? Now, when he was talking about urban communities, urban areas, that's code word for Black also, foundational Black Americans, okay? Back in the late 80s, they would use code words, like as in the media would use code words to talk about Blacks. So instead of saying, Black people, they would say, urban people, because they were minimizing the fact that many Black Americans lived in the suburbs and in rural areas. They were making it seem as though Black people only lived in places like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, D.C., Atlanta, Houston, Los Angeles, what else? St. Louis, and Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. There's other cities that I haven't thought of in my head. Oh, and Oakland, California. Okay, so they were basically minimizing our stats, which is how you really get this whole thing of Black people only make up 13% of the population. That 13% that they're counting is the urban cities, because it's a lot more of us. I've always said that it's at least 25% foundation Black Americans that live in the city. And of the 25%, 22% are foundational Black Americans. Pure blood, 100%. I fall in that 3% with the mix of being foundational Black American and having Hispanic ancestry from my father's mother. Okay? Now I'm going to get into the crux as to why he said this. Okay? And I'm going to say it twice. New York, New York. Okay? New York is the problem in terms of this whole thing going on with revising Black people, not as far as foundation Black Americans not being the rightful people being credited to creating hip hop, and also saying that Black Americans don't have culture. The media that you see all throughout the United States and even around the world is headquartered in New York. Whoever controls the media controls the narrative. It's like whoever wins the war controls the narrative of the war. They control the outcome. The victor basically reigns, So you have this media center, New York, that's basically controlling the narrative of hip hop, the origins of hip hop. So in the 1990s, this is how the story comes out, where hip hop comes from Jamaica. But they really couldn't say, well, how do we say it? So they used Kool Herc as a prop to basically state that, he came over here in 73 and brought the turntables, when in fact, Kool Herc came over here when he was 12 approaching 13, in 1966, and he was tall. He was tall for his age, but he was a youth. He was a youth, and they concocted this thing that this man created it when he's never said he created it. He's never, ever, ever promoted that lie. He benefits from it financially, but he's never promoted it. Matter of fact, he's always, says, hey, when I was DJing at parties, I would try to play, reggae. Because at the time, there wasn't dance hall. Dance hall was coming up, but it didn't touch America until 78. Okay? These are known facts. You can look it up in archives. What happens is that he's being told, hey, they don't want to hear reggae. They don't want to hear Caribbean music. They wanted me to play James Brown. So I played James Brown. Now, Kool Herc was very popular and very well liked. And most of his friends were foundational Black Americans. And he even says, they were the ones that taught me style. They were the ones that introduced me to music. And even when I was growing up in Jamaica, I listened to Black American music. So in other words, although reggae was building up steam and popularity in the 1960s, many of the parents of Jamaican children listened to Black American music. They just loved our music and sound. And that's what influenced reggae. Now, when it comes to reggae, it doesn't mean that reggae is a Black American art form. But what it means is that reggae is an interpretation of Black, foundational Black American music. And it's their spin on our R&B and our rock and roll, our blues, and even some of our jazz and their music, native music, mento, and combine that together, and you got reggae, okay? But we was cool with it. We never said, you fucking stole reggae from us. No, we're not, because Black Americans, we are very naturally sharing people, okay? But in the 90s, you also had two things coming up. The 20th anniversary of what they call the start of hip hop, even though the media has said, it's not the year it started, it's the year that we noticed it. So we give that date, August of 73, the date of the foundation of hip hop, which the media is wrong about. But it's also the time of the rise of the East Coast, West Coast beef, okay? So what you have is this whole beef that was not started by Jamaicans. I want to make that clear. And it wasn't started by the West Coast. It wasn't really even started by so much East Coast rappers. It was started by one rapper named Tim Dog, who came out with a song called F. Compton. All right. I've seen the video. It's horrible. All right. And he was born in the Bronx to Bayesian parents. And what happens is NWA, particularly Eazy-E, sees this video. And Eazy-E says something that is relatively known. If he ever comes to LA, his head will be on a platter. They were going to have him murked. These are known facts. So what happens is Tim Dog comes out with another record dissing Compton. Now, yes, he was dissing Compton, but he was also doing something under the slide. He was really dissing foundational Black Americans because Compton, LA, was cities that were known, well populated of foundational Black Americans, descendants of slaves, ancestors who came from Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. Many also came from Mississippi, like Randy and Snoop Dogg, who are cousins, Alabama, Oklahoma, list goes on and on and on. So this is the beginning of not just the real beefing in hip hop, but also where people end up saying F the South. The Ghetto Boys, even though Bushwick Bill was Jamaican, they was going on stage and people was like, F the South. And they was coming to New York, hearing this. They were like, wait a minute, how could they say F the South when they got family, many of them that's from the South? That was because the media was pushing these narratives to cause discord between Black Americans and Caribbean Americans, descendants, okay? This was a push. Then you had the gangs coming out of New York City. At that time, you had the gang culture coming out, and then you had the Latino gangs because of the rise of different groups. You had Dominicans really coming over. Puerto Ricans was here for decades. But this is when the breakup of the unity between Blacks and Puerto Ricans started happening in the 90s, because in prison, before the 1980s, many of the prisons were populated by mostly Puerto Ricans and Cubans, okay? But when Dominicans come and they get arrested and they serve time, they wanted everybody who was Latino to be with them. And if you wasn't, you had problems, okay? I mentioned this in a couple of commentaries with my father when he served time. Because he was half Cuban, he was like in a rock and a hard place. And they was like, you're one of us. You got to be with us. So this changes dynamics. And when a lot of those people come out of prison, this is how you have that whole Latin unity. Because before the 1990s, it was not like that. Okay? Remember, I'm born in 83. I grew up in New York City. I'm fourth generation New Yorker. I could tell you, Puerto Ricans had more of a bond with Black Americans than they did with other Latinos. But by the 90s, the shift started. In fact, Joe, he's another one I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about him in another podcast, probably tomorrow or Saturday. Now, getting back to New York. New York created this. And what New York was really doing, New York was really insulting foundational Black Americans because they wanted us out the cities. Around this time coming up was the rise of gentrification. That was also happening. And they wanted FBAs to go back to the South or go to other places in the United States because they wanted to bring Trevor Smith Jr.'s people, i.e. Jamaicans, and other Caribbeans over to the U.S. So in the 2000s, you start going to college and you start seeing less of you all, us as in FBAs, and more of them. It wasn't like FBAs wasn't going to college in New York. They wasn't really letting us in unless, and I'm going to say this, unless we had ancestry that was outside of being American. Okay? I kid you not. I have FBA friends who was applying to like CUNY colleges. If you know about CUNY in New York, they was like, I couldn't get in. And I had decent grades. But those that was coming as international students, they was letting them in. And people was like, wait a minute. How everybody in these schools are practically foreigners, but most of us in these schools are Black Americans, and we're basically applying, and they're turning us down, and we got good grades. So many of my friends who's FBA, they went to SUNY, or they ended up going to like HBCUs, small colleges, and graduating with astronomical amounts of debt when they could have went here to the cities and graduated with zero debt, right? So that was the start of replacement. Now, at the time, Busta Rhymes, who got his name from a foundational Black American football player, basically did not ever showcase his views of this animosity towards us until he basically got dumped by his childhood sweetheart baby mother for a woman. Now, the baby mother is now a lesbian, but she's a foundational Black American. So this is where a lot of that anger comes from. Also, the rise of the Southern rappers. By 2006, Busta Rhymes wasn't really making a lot of noise on the charts, but you had people like Lil Wayne. You had people like Little John, the East Side Boys. You had the Yin Yang Twins. You had that group, the Youngbloods. You had, there's so many rappers. I'm thinking T.I., perfect example. T.I., when his career was declining, T.I.'s career rose. You know? So he has an anger over that because that was the decline of New York hip hop. And people wanted to hear from the South, and people were tired of New York basically being the gatekeepers. Because if people don't know this, but in the early days of hip hop, like in the late 70s, early 80s, up until really the late 80s, actually, unless you was West Indian, you wasn't getting put on. So you had a lot of rappers who saw that coming out of New York, and they was like, well, let me lie and say my father's West Indian, and let me just lie and say I got a grandparent. Like LL Cool J, for years would tell people, my grandfather is from the Barbados. Come to find out, that was his step-grandfather who married his mother's mother. And if you know his career, he always had hit records. But that's how he was able to break in, claiming that as his actual heritage, when through bloodline, it really wasn't. But many of them started to do that because they realized, hey, in New York, we gotta, if I want to get in, let me just, say this so that I will have a career, because they were gatekeepers. And it's been alleged that the gatekeeper of this was Grandmaster Flash. Not Kool Herc nor Africa Bambaataa. As much as we can't stand Bambaataa, he wasn't doing that. It's been alleged that it was Grandmaster Flash that was doing a lot of gatekeeping. And a lot of those people were hurt, which is why when the California rappers were coming up, they always sold more. A lot of those old school rappers never sold a lot. And that was because in California, and even in the South, there's a camaraderie in each other. And that's what FBA has. That's part of our culture. We have a camaraderie culture. Whereas a lot of people in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, they got a cutthroat culture. They don't have a lot of unity. And I've had a lot of Caribbean friends in New York tell me that you guys, you American blacks, y'all stick together. Like, for instance, we have family reunions. Have you ever seen Caribbeans in America have a family reunion? Like, fresh, I don't want to say that term, but like, not born here Caribbeans, came here 20 years ago Caribbeans, they don't have family reunions. Many of them don't even talk to their siblings. They don't even talk to their nieces and nephews. They will walk by them. So if they don't have camaraderie with their family, what the hell makes you think they're going to have real camaraderie with you? I'm not saying all of them are like that, but a lot of them are. Because you know why? Because many of them that I know have told me. And I was shocked. Because I'm thinking, wait, we don't stick together like that. It was like, no, yes, y'all do. Y'all go to church together. Y'all have family dinners together. Y'all have family reunions. Y'all go to parties together. We don't do that like that. I was like, oh, wow. And those are things to be proud of, but that's part of FBA culture. So what Trevor Smith, a.k.a. Busta Rhymes, is really doing, he's really being an agent of chaos. And Busta Rhymes has been canceled because I saw him personally and saw a Black American man who was a heroin addict, who was basically saying, I love your music. And he told him to shut up and said, don't bring this noise to me. I'm Jamaican. We don't tolerate the way you act. And the man did nothing rude. And I felt so bad for him because the man was like so drunk, like zonked out. He was like, okay. And people was like, whoa. And this is 2020. So Busta Rhymes been falling out of favor with people. And I'm just going to wrap it up because I know a lot of people have been saying this, but I want to say one thing also. What ruined New York hip hop was this lie that came out. New York rappers who have FBA backgrounds, and this goes back to the 70s, they really was thinking that because they was from New York, they was better than everybody else. Because the media had told them that being in New York was like king. And New York City in particular has always, since 1863, with the race riots of New York, has always favored immigrants. So the greatest, quote unquote, greatest city in the world has an immigrant lean. And that has to do with the Irish being in power when they rose to power. So even though they didn't really control the financial centers and things like that, they control law enforcement. So I'm going to say something. I'm going to drop I don't want to say Easter egg, but I'm going to drop a dime. My friends in college who were Caribbean and African, they told me that when they went through INS, they were told by white men, if you want to make it in America, do not associate with Black Americans. No matter what, even if they come from good backgrounds, because they will taint your mind and they will have you basically being angry and want to protest this country. And you don't want to do that, because if you get involved in things like that, you will go back home and never return to America. They also mentioned how we as Black Americans had a history of uprisings. And they were telling them stay away from them. Like, you could talk to them a little bit, but you got to come here and go to school. And the fact that many of these people were international students, they was getting money. So many of them would talk to me. They would talk to me and they would talk to some of the others. But the rest of them, they had nothing to do with Black Americans, because they knew that they needed to go to school. So they basically, some of them would regurgitate those, things of FBAs don't have any culture. And some of them admitted that we were told this when we first came here. They were told this by white people. You want to know what the funny part? Many of those white people, they told me, had Irish last names. You can't make this up. You can't make this up. And I'm like, wow. And you want to know what the funny thing was? They was telling me this at different times, and different groups of them was telling this to me and others. And this was when I said, you know what? There's something to this. So we know he was born here, Busta Rhymes, but my question is also, is Busta being paid to do this? Because if he's being paid to do this, he's going to keep it up. But his legacy is tainted. It's shot at. And I'm going to end it on this note. Foundational Black Americans, descendants of United States history, culture, who made the culture, and descendants of chattel slavery, the worst type of slavery in human history, not only created hip-hop, but created practically all the music that comes out the United States. We are the culture, okay? And Busta Rhymes, we basically, thought she was cool, but you gotta go, bro. And with that being said, I'm signing off. I know I've been on here for practically 30 minutes, but I had to say this. So, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell, and I will talk to you all later. Take care.